Nurse notices severe injuries on mother in maternity, but what she discovers next makes her call the police immediately. What happens when a simple nurse becomes the only hope for a mother at risk? Amid the chaos of a public hospital in Chicago, Grace Johnson finds herself facing a situation that will change her life forever. While attending to Rachel Turner, a young mother with suspicious injuries, Grace discovers that motherhood is not just a moment of joy, but also a battlefield against abuse and oppression. What will she do upon discovering a network of corruption and violence that threatens not only Rachel's life, but also her own? In Chicago, an overloaded public hospital is the setting where lives intersect and stories of pain and hope unfold. Grace Johnson, a 34-year-old nurse, has always dreamed of making a difference in the lives of the mothers and babies she cares for. The daughter of a retired nurse, she grew up surrounded by stories of struggle and resilience, shaping her desire to care for the vulnerable. However, what Grace did not expect was that her protective instinct would lead her to a terrifying mystery. In the maternity ward, the environment reflects the constant struggle between life and death. Grace is confronted with the sounds of medical equipment and the cries of newborns, but behind this scene, she perceives the hidden sadness in some women's eyes. When she meets Rachel, a 28-year-old woman who arrives at the hospital with bruises, Grace immediately senses that something is wrong. Rachel's hesitation to speak about her injuries stirs a whirlwind of emotions in Grace, who finds herself torn between the duty to care and the urgency to protect that vulnerable mother. The conflict intensifies when Grace discovers that Rachel is under the influence of her husband, Michael, a controlling and intimidating man. The fear Rachel feels towards him prevents her from revealing the truth, creating a barrier between the two women. Grace, in turn, faces a moral dilemma: how to help Rachel without putting her own life at risk. This tension transforms into a call to action, driving Grace to investigate not only what is happening to Rachel, but also the corruption that permeates the hospital. As Grace navigates this new territory, she encounters other figures who complicate her journey. Dr. Linda Carter, the chief physician of the maternity ward, initially admired by Grace, soon reveals herself to be an unexpected ally of the system that perpetuates the abuses. The hostile environment of the hospital and the constant pressure from Michael make the situation even more challenging, putting at risk not only Rachel's life but also Grace's career. The story unfolds in a crescendo of emotions, where the fight for truth and the quest for justice become essential not only for Rachel, but also for Grace. With each step she takes, Grace learns more about herself, confronting past traumas and challenging her own limitations. The decision to fight alongside Rachel transforms her life, leading her to a new beginning that makes her question what truly matters. Thus, Grace Johnson's journey becomes a powerful story of overcoming, friendship, and courage. In a world where fear and silence often prevail, she uncovers the strength that resides in vulnerability and the struggle for a better future. What seemed like just another day in the hospital turns into a battle for life and dignity, showing that even in the darkest situations, hope can blossom. The tension in the hospital was palpable. The corridors, often filled with laughter and shouts of joy, were now cloaked in a shroud of concern. Grace Johnson observed the tired faces of her colleagues as they struggled to meet the growing demand of patients. The pressure was intense, but nothing had prepared her for what was to come. Rachel Turner had become a symbol of resistance for Grace. Ever since the young mother entered the hospital, her eyes filled with fear and her body marked by bruises, Grace had felt an immediate connection. However, the situation was becoming increasingly complicated. The presence of Michael, Rachel's controlling and threatening husband, loomed over them like a shadow. She knew she needed to act, but the fear of retaliation left her paralyzed. The first challenge arose when Grace decided to talk to Rachel, trying to break the silence that surrounded her. "Rachel, can you tell me what happened?" Her voice was gentle, but there was an urgency that betrayed her concern. Rachel hesitated, looking at the floor as if the words were stuck in her throat. Grace felt her heart race. She knew that if Rachel didn't speak, there would be no way to help her, and the thought of leaving such a vulnerable mother in the clutches of an abuser left her distressed. Then, Dr. Linda Carter, the chief physician of the maternity ward, entered the room. Grace admired Linda, but her presence now felt like an obstacle. Linda, with her authoritative demeanor and critical gaze, did not seem willing to tolerate investigations that could tarnish the hospital's reputation. "Grace, we need to focus on what really matters: saving lives. We cannot get distracted by personal issues," Linda said, her voice firm. This comment filled Grace with frustration, She knew Rachel's life was at stake, but how could she convince Linda to see beyond protocol? As Grace battled these new obstacles, she also faced emotional challenges. The memory of her own childhood, marked by a mother who was always ready to help, but who also suffered at the hands of an abusive father, invaded her mind. Why had she not noticed the signs of abuse before? Guilt and pain began to intertwine, causing her to question her own inner strength. I should do more, she thought, the weight of responsibility almost crushing her. Over time, Grace realized she was not alone in this struggle. A newly graduated nurse, Sophia, began to reach out to her. Sophia, full of energy and determination, seemed willing to challenge the system. "Grace, we need to do something. We can't let Rachel suffer in silence," Sophia said, her eyes shining with a passion that resonated with Grace. This unlikely friendship became a support for Grace, but it also brought new challenges. Sophia's determination to expose the truth could put both of them at risk. As the days passed, Grace found herself in a cycle of tension and relief. Every time Michael appeared at the hospital, the atmosphere changed. The fear he exuded was almost palpable. Grace tried to stay strong, but the feeling of being watched made her feel vulnerable. She knew that at any moment she could be discovered, and that was terrifying. The urge to protect Rachel and her baby grew, but with each plan she devised, her insecurity increased. One day, after an especially tough shift, a hospital security guard approached her. "You're getting into trouble, nurse," he said in a threatening tone. Grace's heart raced. The reality of what she was facing became increasingly clear. The corruption she suspected was indeed rooted in the system. The support she had hoped to find in her colleagues felt distant, and the pressure to back down grew. The fear of losing her job and the security she had built over the years almost made her give up. However, Grace was not the type to easily surrender. The memory of Rachel's desperate gaze propelled her to move forward. She remembered that many others also needed help. She could not allow fear to take over. "If I don't fight for her, who will?" Grace thought. This renewed determination made her realize she was at a crossroads. Either she gave in to despair, or she fought with all her strength for truth and justice. Grace's journey was about to intensify, and every step she took would bring her closer to the truth, but also closer to danger. The lessons she had learned throughout her life were about to be tested in ways she had never imagined. And so, amid the chaos of the hospital, the battle for Rachel's life and dignity would become the battle for Grace's very soul. Grace felt trapped in a whirlwind of emotions. The internal struggle between the desire to help Rachel and the fear of the consequences consumed her. The next day brought a new wave of tension. Upon arriving at the hospital, she found Sophia sitting in the cafeteria looking worried. "Did you see Michael today?" Sophia asked, her voice betraying a mix of concern and determination. Grace shook her head, but a part of her knew it was just a matter of time before he showed up again. The atmosphere in the hospital seemed more oppressive each day. The sleepless nights accumulated, and Grace noticed her energy was dwindling. The pressure to care for patients, combined with the weight of Rachel's situation, made her feel increasingly overwhelmed. On one of those days, while treating a patient, her hand trembled slightly. The nurse working beside her noticed and asked, "Are you okay, Grace?" She forced a smile, but the truth was she was far from feeling well. The burden she carried felt heavier with each passing moment. That same day, after her shift, Grace decided she needed a plan. If she couldn't rely on Linda or the other nurses, she would have to act alone. With Sophia's help, they began gathering information about Rachel's situation. They spoke with other patients, trying to understand Michael's history of violence and behavior. However, each step they took seemed to lead to more challenges. Patients were reluctant to speak, fearing repercussions. Fear was an invisible wall that prevented them from moving forward. One night, while Grace reviewed the collected data, she received an anonymous message on her phone. "Be careful what you're doing. Michael is not someone you want to anger." The message left her in shock. The warning sent a chill down her spine. The fear transformed into a weight that made it hard for her to breathe. It was a clear reminder that she was in a dangerous game, but at the same time, her determination to help Rachel grew. She remembered the desperate look of the young mother, and it made her want to fight even more. In the following days, Michael's behavior became increasingly aggressive. He frequently appeared at the hospital, watching Rachel with a possessive gaze that made her shrink. Grace felt her heart tighten every time he entered the room. The atmosphere became heavy, and the fear that something terrible could happen to that family consumed her. She knew that if she didn't act, it could be too late. Sophia, noticing the growing tension, suggested that Grace speak to a social worker who worked at the hospital. He may be able to help intervene in Rachel's situation, Sophia said, with a glimmer of hope in her eyes. Grace hesitated. What would she say to a social worker? What if it only made things worse for Rachel? But the idea began to take shape in her mind, and she decided she could not stand still. That same night, Grace sat down with the social worker, a calm and experienced man named Tom. She shared the information she had gathered, and to her surprise, Tom was receptive. "We need to act quickly. Abuse is not something we can ignore," he said, and Tom's words brought a breath of relief. However, the feeling that each step they took could unleash Michael's wrath was always present. Meanwhile, the friendship between Grace and Sophia began to face its own tensions. Sophia was impulsive and wanted to act immediately, while Grace preferred a more cautious plan. "Why need to be quick, Grace? We can't wait any longer," Sophia exclaimed in a moment of frustration. Grace, however, felt that every decision they made had consequences and wanted to ensure they were doing what was right. This divergence of opinions created a rift between them, but Grace knew she needed to find a middle ground. The emotional weight of the situation was starting to affect Grace physically. She began to experience constant headaches and a fatigue that seemed endless. Looking in the mirror, she saw deep dark circles under her eyes. "You can't let yourself be defeated," she reminded herself, but the words sounded hollow. The fight for Rachel was becoming a fight for her own sanity. Then, the situation reached a breaking point. One morning, while Grace was on her shift, she learned that Michael had assaulted Rachel outside the hospital. The rumor spread quickly, and despair took hold of Grace. She felt powerless as she saw Rachel, with a bruised face and tear-filled eyes. Grace's heart broke. "I'm sorry, I couldn't help in time," she whispered to herself, as the reality of failure engulfed her. Now, Grace was at a crossroads. It was time to decide: continue fighting or surrender to the fear that paralyzed her. Rachel's gaze haunted her, and with it, the determination not to give up ignited. She knew that, regardless of the risks, she needed to protect Rachel and her baby. The battle was far from over, and Grace was about to discover what it truly meant to overcome her own fears. Grace was sitting in a chair next to Rachel's bed, watching the young mother trying to hide her pain. Rachel's face was marked by bruises, and her eyes, once filled with hope, now reflected only fear. Grace felt a wave of helplessness wash over her. For weeks, she had fought to help Rachel, but now she felt that her efforts had been in vain. Guilt consumed her, and she couldn't find the words to comfort her friend. The atmosphere in the hospital was tense. The medical staff whispered about what had happened, and Grace knew that the situation had become critical. It was at that moment that the social worker, Tom, entered the room with a serious expression. He approached Grace and Rachel and, in a firm voice, said, "We need to do something now. We can't let this continue." The determination in Tom's words sparked a glimmer of hope in Grace, but it was soon overshadowed by fear. What would they do? What would Michael do if he knew they were planning to act? Grace looked at Rachel, who was staring at her with a mix of gratitude and desperation. This was a choice that could not be taken lightly. It was then that Grace received another anonymous message on her phone. "You don't know who you're dealing with. Act with caution." The warning made her heart race. The pressure seemed to mount, and she felt cornered. The weight of her responsibilities and the fear of what might happen to Rachel if things went wrong left her distressed. Sophia appeared in the room, her expression determined. "Grace, we can't wait any longer. We have to get Rachel to a safe place. The social worker can help us with that," she insisted. But Grace hesitated. What if that made things worse? What if Michael got even angrier? Doubt consumed her. She remembered how quickly things had escalated and feared that any misstep could lead to terrible consequences. As the discussion between the two friends intensified, Grace felt an increasing pressure in her chest. It was as if something inside her was breaking. Then, looking at Rachel, she realized the truth she had ignored. This fight was not just about her or what could happen to Rachel, but about the life of the young mother and the child to come. What Grace wanted for herself no longer mattered. What truly mattered was protecting Rachel. She couldn't let fear paralyze her. With this revelation, Grace made a decision. "We're going to do this. We're going to help Rachel," she said, her voice firm. Sophia smiled, relieved, but at the same time, Grace felt a chill run down her spine, aware of the risks they were taking. Tom, noticing their determination, began to devise a plan. He explained how they could protect Rachel and her baby. The idea that she could have a safe haven brought some relief to Grace, but the shadow of Michael still loomed over them like a threatening cloud. Time was running out. As they prepared to take action, Grace remembered her own fears. For too long, she had hesitated to act, allowing uncertainty and doubt to take over. Now, however, she realized that true courage was not the absence of fear, but the ability to act despite it. If she didn't confront this situation, she would be failing not only Rachel, but all the women who had suffered in silence. With the plan in mind, they gathered in a nearby room where Tom presented the available resources. Grace felt a mix of hope and anxiety. The adrenaline propelled her, but uncertainties cloaked her like a heavy mantle. Deep down, she knew this was just the first step in a long battle. When the moment to act finally arrived, Grace and Sophia were ready. They knew that getting Rachel to a safe place would only be the beginning. The road ahead was fraught with challenges, and the specter of Michael remained a constant threat. But now Grace was determined. Instead of letting fear defeat her, she would choose to fight. In that moment, she understood that true strength lay in getting up and taking action, even when the world around her seemed to be crumbling. With this new perspective, Grace felt ready to face any adversity that lay ahead. Her heart raced as she prepared for action. The plan was set: take Rachel to a safe shelter where she and her baby could stay away from Michael. At that moment, Grace's determination was palpable, but anxiety also consumed her. The uncertainties of what could happen next haunted her. As they left the room, Grace noticed that the hospital corridor seemed longer than ever. Each step was a struggle against the fear settling in her chest. For a moment, she looked at Rachel and saw her friend's fragility. The young mother was trying to hold it together, but her eyes betrayed the storm of emotions swirling inside. Grace imagined what Rachel's life would be like after this change. Could she really have a fresh start? Sophia, who walked alongside them, noticed the tense silence. "We can do this, Grace. Rachel is strong, and so are you," she said, trying to encourage her friend. But even Sophia's words couldn't dispel the shadow hanging over Grace. What if Michael found them? What if they failed? Upon reaching the hospital exit, Tom was waiting for them. He had a car parked, ready to take Rachel to the shelter. The social worker looked at them with a serious expression, but there was a glimmer of hope in his eyes. "We are ready. We need to act fast," he said, and the three women nodded. The moment of hesitation had passed. As they headed to the car, Grace couldn't help but feel a wave of adrenaline. It was as if life was pushing her forward, challenging her to face her fears. But at the same time, the pressure of knowing they were fleeing from a violent man left her unsettled. She knew that even at that moment, Michael could be wondering where Rachel was. After putting Rachel in the back seat, Grace sat next to her. The young mother looked at Grace, and a look of gratitude crossed their faces. But behind that look, Grace saw fear, the fear of what was to come. She held Rachel's hand, and for a moment they felt a connection. It was a bond of solidarity forged in the flames of adversity. The car accelerated, and as they drove, Grace watched the world pass by through the window. The streets that once felt familiar now seemed strange, as if she were seeing everything for the first time. Life continued, but for them, everything had changed. The weight of responsibility on their shoulders was immense, and the uncertainty of the future left her restless. During the journey, Grace began to think about the consequences of what they were doing. What if Michael found them? What if he didn't accept Rachel's decision? Anger and revenge could lead to terrible situations. She remembered stories she had heard about women who tried to escape abusive relationships and paid a high price for it. Her heart tightened, and a wave of despair almost made her give up. But she recalled the determination she had felt earlier. Now more than ever, she needed to be strong. When they arrived at the shelter, a discreet and welcoming place, Grace felt a mix of relief and fear. They were safe for now, but the fight was far from over. Tom helped Rachel enter and showed her the space that would now be her temporary home. Grace accompanied her, trying to offer support, but the truth was she also felt lost. The following weeks were a whirlwind of emotions. Rachel was adjusting to the new environment, but Michael's shadow still loomed over them. Grace became Rachel's closest support. They spent hours talking about life, the future, and the dreams that felt so distant. Grace tried to encourage her, but often found herself struggling against her own fears. Each day, Grace faced new challenges. Dealing with Rachel's emotions was exhausting. She felt responsible for her friend and the baby that was on the way. The nights were long and filled with insomnia, and whenever she closed her eyes, the fear of Michael haunted her. What could he be doing? Would he come looking for them? In a moment of vulnerability, Grace sat next to Rachel, who was looking out the window. "Are you thinking about what happened?" Grace asked softly. Rachel looked at her, her eyes filled with tears, and replied, "Sometimes I feel like he's still here, close to me, as if I can't escape." Grace held her friend's hand, and for a moment they shared the pain that had become part of their lives. Deep down, Grace realized that the battle was not just external. It was an internal struggle, a journey of self-discovery. She needed to find her own strength to keep fighting, not just for Rachel, but for herself. It was time to face not only Michael's demons, but also the fears that imprisoned her. And by doing so, she would begin to truly live again. Grace watched Rachel, who was trying to find comfort amid the chaos that her life had become. The young mother was in a safe place, but Michael's shadow still hung over her. Grace knew that for Rachel, the fight was far from over, but her friend also knew she needed to find her own strength. Grace's determination to help her rise again grew increasingly intense, but it was also a battle within herself. She remembered her own fears, the sleepless nights wondering if she was doing the right thing. The weight of responsibility on her shoulders was immense, and the uncertainty of the future left her restless. Grace realized that it wasn't just Rachel who needed support. She was also searching for her own courage. One morning, while having coffee, Rachel looked at Grace and said that she didn't know how to move forward and felt trapped. Grace felt a pang of empathy. She knew what it was like to feel paralyzed, unable to advance. But in that moment, she found the courage to open her heart. She admitted that she also felt lost at times, but the truth was that they could find a way together. Life could be tough, but they had each other. These words echoed in Grace's mind, and she realized that vulnerability itself was a form of strength. By supporting Rachel, she was also allowing herself to be supported. They began to share not only their fears, but also their hopes. Grace remembered her childhood dreams and how distant they seemed. Together they started to chart a new path, one that included the possibility of a brighter future. As the days passed, Grace found herself transforming. She began to practice small acts of self-confidence. Instead of letting fear dominate her, she decided she needed to take care of herself too. She started taking walks in the nearby park, writing in a journal, and connecting with other women who had gone through similar experiences. These interactions helped her realize she wasn't alone in her struggle. Their strength inspired her to face her own demons. The friendship between Grace and Rachel also evolved. They became accomplices, sharing not only hardships but also moments of joy. They laughed together, made plans, and even daydreamed about what the future could hold. Grace began to see Rachel as a source of inspiration. Her friend's strength, even in the face of fear, encouraged her to keep moving forward. One night, as they were getting ready for bed, Grace received an unsettling message from Tom. Michael had been seen near the shelter. Her heart raced, and anxiety enveloped her like a heavy cloak. Rachel noticed her nervousness and asked what was wrong. Grace hesitated but decided to be honest. She told Rachel that Michael might be nearby and that they needed to stay alert. In that moment, Grace realized that she couldn't let fear dominate their lives. They had found a place to rebuild, and they couldn't allow the shadow of the past to follow them. Together, they decided they needed to strengthen their support network. They sought guidance at the shelter and joined a group of women facing similar situations. This new connection brought hope. Over time, Grace began to see life with new eyes. She learned that true wealth wasn't in material possessions, but in the relationships she cultivated and the strength she found within herself. Success for her was no longer about external achievements, but about the ability to rise after each fall and move forward. The fear of Michael was still present, but Grace understood that the internal struggle was just as important as the external one. She began to apply the lessons she had learned in the previous weeks. With each passing day, she became stronger, not only for Rachel but for herself. Grace realized that she had found a new purpose in life, to be a source of support for other women while rediscovering herself. Their journey was far from over, but Grace now had a new perspective. By facing challenges, both internal and external, she had transformed her pain into power. After all, life was about new beginnings, and Grace was ready to embrace whatever lay ahead, no longer as a fugitive, but as a strong woman determined to live fully. That morning, the shelter felt quieter than usual. Grace sensed the tension in the air, as if every corner was waiting for something. The warning about Michael left her unsettled, and the fear of him appearing at any moment lingered. She looked at Rachel, who was sitting at the table, distracted by a drawing her daughter had made. Rachel's smile seemed like a ray of sunshine, but Grace knew that Michael's shadow still loomed over them. Deciding that they couldn't allow fear to dominate their lives, Grace and Rachel joined a group of women who met weekly to discuss their challenges. In that meeting, sitting in a circle, each shared their stories, and Grace realized she was not alone. The experiences of other women echoed her own, and gradually hope began to bloom again. But that afternoon, something different happened. During the meeting, the group coordinator received an urgent message. Michael had been spotted near the shelter, and the police were warning everyone to take precautions. The news spread a wave of panic among the women. Grace felt her stomach tighten. The fear she thought she had overcome resurfaced, stronger than ever. Rachel, noticing Grace's reaction, held her hand firmly and reassured her that they were in this together. She reminded Grace of what they had learned, emphasizing that they couldn't let fear control them. Rachel's words were like a balm for Grace's soul, reigniting her determination within. They were no longer the vulnerable women they had once been. Now, they were a united, strong group. That night, as they discussed what to do if Michael really appeared, Grace had an idea. They needed to prepare. They couldn't just stand by and wait for him to come to them. They had to take action. Rachel agreed, and together, they began to plan. They gathered the group and discussed safety strategies. Together, they decided that they would not only defend themselves, but also create a safe and welcoming environment for all the women at the shelter. The next day brought a new energy. Grace felt motivated, not by the absence of fear, but by the presence of courage. They organized a meeting with the police, who provided guidance and resources to deal with the situation. Grace, now more confident, asked questions and sought information, feeling like a leader. However, when the sun set, the tension in the shelter increased. Grace and Rachel were in their room when they suddenly heard screams outside. Grace's heart raced. The two exchanged glances, and without thinking twice, they ran to the window. What they saw made their blood run cold. Michael was there confronting one of the women from the group. He looked threatening, and the atmosphere was charged with fear. Rachel, without hesitation, pulled Grace out of the room. They needed to do something. Grace knew the situation was dangerous, but her friend's determination inspired her. They joined other women from the shelter, and with the help of the police, managed to surround Michael. The confusion escalated, but Grace remembered the lessons she had learned. They were stronger together. As the police worked to control the situation, Grace took a deep breath and remembered the strength she had found within herself. With courage, she decided to step in front of Michael. "You can't intimidate us anymore." Her voice echoed in the air, and the determination radiating from her seemed to inspire the other women. Rachel was by her side, and together they formed a barrier of protection. Michael, surprised by their resistance, hesitated. It was then that Grace realized that true power lay not in intimidation, but in unity. She looked at the women around her, each carrying their own battles, and felt a wave of empathy. "We're here for each other, and we won't let you bring us down." Those words resonated, and the group grew even stronger. The police finally managed to apprehend Michael, and the tension began to dissipate. Grace felt a huge weight lifted off her shoulders. Looking at Rachel and the other women, she realized they had overcome a significant challenge. They had faced fear together, and were now more united than ever. As the dawn of the next day broke, Grace reflected on the journey she had taken. She had learned that true success wasn't about avoiding fear, but about facing challenges with courage and as a community. The failures of the past were no longer a burden, but a part of her story that had helped her grow stronger. The future was still uncertain, but Grace knew that together they could conquer any obstacle. The morning after the intense confrontation, Grace woke up to the soft light of the sun filtering through the curtains. She still felt the adrenaline from the previous night in her body, but there was a new serenity surrounding her. Looking around, she saw Rachel sitting on the bed, lost in thought. Grace remembered the fear she had felt and how they had faced Michael together. The memory warmed her heart. As they got up, the two decided to join the breakfast being served in the shelter's kitchen. The atmosphere was different. There was a sense of camaraderie in the air. The women who had once seemed anxious and fearful were now chatting animatedly, sharing laughter and stories. Grace realized that the unity that had formed was a powerful force. They were not just survivors, but warriors who had supported each other. "Did you see how motivated everyone was yesterday?" Rachel commented as she poured herself some coffee. "I have never seen such strong energy among us." Grace nodded, a smile spreading across her face. "Yes, and it made me realize that we are not alone. Each of us has a story and a struggle, but together we are stronger." The day passed with conversations and planning. Grace and Rachel sat with other women to discuss what they had learned the night before. They talked about the importance of unity and courage, and how even in the face of fear, it was possible to find strength. Grace noticed that many were willing to share their experiences, which brought a sense of healing to the group. It's amazing how we can change the environment around us just by being there for each other, Grace reflected aloud. When Michael showed up, I thought everything was lost, but instead, we found our strength. The conversation flowed, and by the end of breakfast, Grace felt more connected than ever. The shelter was no longer just a place of refuge. It had become a community. They had become friends, confidants, and more importantly, a support network. Throughout the day, there were many moments of laughter and sincere hugs, and Grace realized that life could be filled with light, even after darkness. However, as night approached, a new concern arose. Michael was still in custody, but the feeling of insecurity lingered in the air. Grace knew they couldn't just relax. They needed to be prepared for any eventuality. So, they decided to hold a special meeting to discuss what they could do if he were released. During the meeting, Grace stepped forward and shared her thoughts. We can't live in fear, but we need to be prepared. Let's unite more than ever. We can create a warning system and a safety plan for all of us. The women listened attentively. One of them, Louisa, raised her hand. What if we do self-care activities? That will help us become emotionally stronger. We need to take care of ourselves and each other. Grace smiled. That's a great idea, Louisa. Let's do it. Together, we won't just be stronger, we'll be healthier too. As the weeks went by, the shelter transformed into a vibrant space. Grace and the other women implemented various activities, from self-care classes to art sessions. They became a true home, where each one could express their emotions and find support. One night, while everyone was gathered for a yoga session, Grace felt overwhelmed by a wave of gratitude. She looked around and saw smiling faces, women who, despite their struggles, were rising again. That space had become a symbol of resilience and hope. After the practice, Rachel approached Grace. You remembered what we said about fear? Look around us. We turned this into strength. Grace nodded, feeling the weight of what they had overcome. Yes, and it makes me believe that we can face any challenge that comes our way. No matter what happens, we have each other. As the night progressed, Grace realized she had changed. The fear hadn't completely disappeared, but now it coexisted with the hope and strength she had discovered. They had become a beacon of light, not only for themselves, but also for other women who might enter the shelter in the future. The journey wasn't over. It was just the beginning of a new story, written with courage, unity, and love. Weeks passed, and the shelter transformed into a true home where love and friendship flourished among the women. Grace and her companions faced the uncertainty of life with renewed courage, but Michael's shadow still loomed over them. What was once just fear was now becoming determination. They knew they needed to prepare for what might come. One night, while everyone gathered to discuss a safety plan, Grace had an idea. We need to protect ourselves and ensure that Michael doesn't have the chance to hurt us again. We won't let him destroy what we've built here. The women agreed, and together they began to devise a plan. With the support of a local attorney, they learned about their rights and the protection laws that could be enacted. The unity that had formed in the shelter was unbreakable. They became more than friends. They were sisters fighting for a common goal. Each of them brought their skills and experiences, creating an environment where strength and wisdom intertwined. Grace realized that by facing her fears, she not only became stronger, but also inspired others to do the same. The decision to act materialized when, on a sunny morning, Grace and the other women headed to court to testify against Michael. The room was filled with tension, but their determination was palpable. Grace felt her heart race, but she was determined not to let fear take over. When it was her turn to speak, Grace looked into the judge's eyes and told her story. She expressed the impact Michael had on her life and how it led her to find her true strength. Her words resonated in the room, and the emotion overflowing from her touched everyone present. Grace's testimony and that of the other women were powerful. They showed not only the pain they had suffered, but also the strength they had found. Michael was convicted, and the judge issued a restraining order, ensuring he could not approach the shelter. It was a victory not just for Grace, but for all the women who had united around a common goal. As they left the courtroom, Grace felt light. The burden she had carried for so long began to dissipate. She realized that even though the past could not be changed, the choices they made now would shape their future. With Michael's conviction, They not only protected themselves, but also found a new purpose: to help other women facing similar situations. Grace's journey transformed her. She learned that true strength comes from within and that unity makes a difference. The friendships she had cultivated in the shelter were not just bonds. They were a constant reminder that they were not alone. Grace had become an advocate for change, using her voice to inspire and support other women. Reflecting on everything she had experienced, Grace understood that revenge, in its truest sense, was not about returning evil, but about turning pain into power. And so she and her friends began to plan workshops and events to empower women in their communities, sharing their stories and promoting healing. Grace's story doesn't end here. Just like her, each of us has the ability to rise and rewrite our narrative. Life can be challenging, but the strength we find when we come together is unparalleled. May Grace's journey inspire everyone to reflect on their own experiences and unite in the pursuit of a brighter future. If you have also faced challenges and found strength in your journey, share your story in the comments. Let's create a space of support and inspiration. Like this video and subscribe so we can continue bringing stories that make a difference. Together we can light the way for many others. It's time to take action.